The atmosphere inside the press room was electric, charged with an intensity that went beyond the usual tension of political briefings. This wasn't just another routine exchange between politicians and the media. It was a showdown. The cameras were already rolling, reporters whispering among themselves, sensing that this would be a moment that could shift narratives, careers, and headlines. At the heart of it stood Karoline Leavitt, a woman known for her sharp rhetoric and unwavering confidence, walking into the room like a gladiator stepping onto the battlefield. There was no hesitation in her stride, no uncertainty in her gaze as she took her position at the podium, ready to deliver what was certain to be one of the most talked-about press conferences of the year. Across from her, seated at the front of the room, was Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, known for her fierce political stances and unfiltered opinions. Unlike other press briefings where politicians faced only the media, today was different. Omar was not just an observer, but a central figure in what was about to unfold. As Leavitt adjusted the microphone, the room fell into silence. Every camera lens zooming in, every reporter sitting up straighter, waiting for the first move. She took a deep breath, scanning the audience, then spoke in a voice that was sharp and deliberate. "Let's get one thing straight. What you're about to hear today will expose the biggest lie in Washington." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Reporters exchanged glances, sensing that whatever was coming next would not be business as usual. Omar's expression remained composed, but her fingers lightly drummed against the table, betraying the tension she refused to show. For weeks, the political landscape had been boiling over, a growing controversy surrounding Omar and the policies she championed. The Democratic Party, despite controlling key political strongholds, had been facing increasing scrutiny for what critics called reckless governance. And Leavitt was here to make sure that scrutiny intensified. She wasn't just going to challenge Omar, she was going to dismantle her arguments piece by piece, using evidence, past statements, and policy failures to expose what she claimed was a deeply flawed and deceptive political narrative. Then came the first challenge. A voice from the middle of the room, clear and unwavering, cut through the silence. It was CNN's senior correspondent, a journalist known for pressing conservative figures in ways that often set the tone for the media's broader coverage. "Karoline, are you saying Ilhan Omar has been lying?" The room collectively inhaled. This was the defining moment. The question designed to put Leavitt in a corner, to force her into either softening her stance or doubling down on the gravity of her accusations. But if anyone thought she would hesitate, they were mistaken. Leavitt smirked, leaning slightly forward, her gaze locking onto the reporter before shifting toward Omar. "Not just lying," she said, her tone razor-sharp, "but deceiving millions of Americans." A murmur spread through the room. A pen slipped from a reporter's fingers. Others whispered hurriedly as if realizing this was about to escalate far beyond the typical political sparring session. Omar remained still, but the subtle tightening of her jaw was enough to tell those watching that she understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a press conference. This was a direct attack on her credibility, one that would demand immediate and forceful defense. But Leavitt wasn't finished. She had just set the stage. The real battle was about to begin. The room remained heavy with anticipation, every journalist on edge as Karoline Leavitt's words echoed through the press conference. She had set the tone with her opening line, but this was only the beginning. She wasn't here for pleasantries or vague political rhetoric. She was here to dismantle Ilhan Omar's credibility in front of the nation, with cameras rolling and the internet waiting to amplify every moment. Omar, seated just feet away, remained composed, but the tension in her posture betrayed her. She knew that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be a typical exchange of political talking points. Leavitt exhaled, pausing just long enough to let her first statement sink in. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she lifted a folder from the podium, holding it up for the cameras. For weeks, Ilhan Omar and the Democrats have been pushing a reckless, dangerous narrative. They claim to fight for justice, but today, I'm going to prove that the truth is very different. The statement sent a ripple through the audience. Reporters exchanged hurried glances, already sensing that this press conference was turning into something far more explosive than expected. A voice from the crowd, sharp and unwavering, called out, Karoline, if you're accusing Ilhan Omar and the Democrats of deception, then where's your proof? It was the challenge Leavitt had been waiting for. Oh, I thought you'd never ask, she said, her voice dripping with confidence. Without missing a beat, she flipped open the folder and pulled out a document. Right here. Concrete evidence that exposes everything. The cameras zoomed in. Reporters leaned forward, their pens poised over their notebooks. Even those in the back of the room strained to catch a glimpse of the papers in her hands. Omar, still silent, crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then, finally, she spoke. "This is absurd," she said, shaking her head. "More Republican fear-mongering, more conspiracy theories. The American people deserve better." Leavitt didn't hesitate. "Oh, we agree on one thing, Ilhan. The American people do deserve better, better than the misinformation you've been feeding them." Her voice was unwavering, her presence commanding. The tension in the room thickened, the kind of political moment that left reporters either scrambling to document every second or too transfixed to move. A CNN reporter pressed again. "Then let's hear it, Karoline. What's in that folder?" Leavitt smirked, flipping to the first page. "Let's start with your own words, Ilhan, shall we?" She pulled out a printed statement. "You recently said, and I quote, 'There is no real crisis here. It's all manufactured outrage.'" Leavitt then turned toward the audience. "Tell me, how is it manufactured when crime is rising, when illegal crossings have doubled, when American families are suffering because of reckless policies?" Omar leaned forward, her jaw tightening. "That's a gross misrepresentation of what I said." Leavitt raised an eyebrow. "Really? Then let's talk about what you didn't say, because silence can be just as telling." She flipped another page in the folder. "When violent protest erupted, when small businesses were burned to the ground, when innocent people were hurt, you refused to condemn it. Why?" Omar scoffed, shaking her head. "That is not true." Leavitt didn't miss a beat. "Then say it now, right here, right now. Condemn the violence." The room went silent. Every eye turned to Omar. The camera zoomed in, capturing her reaction in real time. The seconds stretched unbearably long. Omar's lips parted as if to speak, but she hesitated. The hesitation was all Leavitt needed. She smirked, shaking her head. "That's what I thought." Reporters whispered among themselves, some scribbling furiously, others just watching, their eyes darting between the two women. The silence was more damning than anything Leavitt could have said. Omar's refusal, or inability to give a direct answer, had created a defining moment, one that would be replayed on news networks and dissected in political debates for days to come. Leavitt, satisfied, placed the folder back on the podium. "I have more, a lot more, but let's give Ilhan a chance to explain herself first." She gestured toward Omar. "Go ahead, defend your record." Omar took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had been in political battles before, but this wasn't just a press conference anymore. It was a high-profile confrontation where silence, hesitation, and deflection would cost her more than just a bad headline. She straightened her posture, her voice measured but firm. "Let's be clear about what's happening here," she said. "This isn't about facts. This is about Republicans using fear tactics to divide America." Leavitt chuckled, shaking her head. "Classic. When backed into a corner, deflect and attack the messenger." Omar ignored her, turning toward the reporters. "This entire spectacle is designed to distract from real issues: poverty, racial injustice, health care. While Karoline is here waving papers around, real Americans are struggling." Leavitt leaned on the podium, arms crossed, smirking. "Struggling because of failed policies like yours." Omar turned, locking eyes with Leavitt. "Tell me, Karoline, what have you personally done to help struggling families, other than stand here and grandstand?" A murmur rippled through the room. The reporters liked this. It wasn't just a statement, it was a challenge. But Leavitt wasn't rattled. If anything, she looked even more confident. "Well, unlike you, I don't just talk. I act." She lifted another page from her folder. "Let's go over a few things, shall we? Democrat-run cities are seeing record-high crime. Businesses are fleeing. Families can't afford groceries. And you call that progress?" Omar crossed her arms. "That's a gross oversimplification, and you know it. Crime is a complex issue. Leavitt cut in, her voice sharp. Not that complex. Enforce the law. Hold criminals accountable. Stop prioritizing politics over public safety. Omar's eyes darkened, her composure slipping just slightly. You want to talk about accountability? Then let's talk about corruption in your party. Let's talk about election lies, about tax breaks for the wealthy while working families suffer. Levy's expression didn't change. You're right, Ilhan. Let's talk about accountability. That's exactly what we're doing right now. The room was electric. The cameras zoomed in, and Levy, seeing the flicker of frustration in Omar's eyes, knew she had the upper hand. Omar took a steadying breath, determined not to let Karoline Leavitt dictate the terms of the confrontation. She had faced hostile questioning before, had weathered storms of controversy, but this felt different. The cameras weren't just capturing a political exchange, they were broadcasting what was quickly becoming a defining moment, one that could either solidify her standing or expose vulnerabilities in real time. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice measured but forceful. Let's be clear about what's happening here, she began, her eyes scanning the room, landing momentarily on the gathered journalists before returning to Leavitt. This isn't about facts. This is about Republicans using fear tactics to divide Americans. It's a distraction, a smokescreen, designed to pit communities against each other instead of addressing the real issues that matter. Poverty, healthcare, racial justice. Some reporters nodded, jotting down notes, while others watched closely, waiting for Leavitt's response. Leavitt, unfazed, leaned on the podium with a knowing smirk. Classic, she said, shaking her head slightly, her voice thick with mock amusement. When backed into a corner, deflect and attack the messenger. She turned slightly toward the reporters, as if addressing them directly. Have you noticed that, instead of answering the question, plain and simple, Omar shifts the conversation? It's never about her record, her statements, her failures. It's always about how Republicans are the real problem. Omar's jaw tightened, her fingers tapping against the table. But she didn't look away. That's because Republicans thrive on political theater, she shot back. Look at what's happening right now. We're standing here while Karoline waves around papers, grandstanding, instead of focusing on the very real struggles that American families are dealing with every day. Leavitt didn't miss a beat. Struggling, she repeated, nodding. That's an interesting word choice, because struggling is exactly what Americans are doing under Democrat-led policies. She reached into her folder again, pulling out another sheet. Let's talk about facts, shall we? You've said crime isn't a crisis, but crime rates in cities run by Democrats are skyrocketing. Businesses are fleeing. Families can't afford basic goods because of reckless spending and inflation. And instead of solutions, you offer excuses. Omar crossed her arms. That's a gross oversimplification, and you know it. Crime is a complex issue with root causes that need to be addressed through education, economic opportunity, and community engagement. Simply throwing out talking points about Democrat-run cities doesn't solve anything. Leavitt raised an eyebrow. Not that complex. Enforce the law. Hold criminals accountable. Stop prioritizing politics over public safety. She let the words settle before pressing forward. You talk about poverty, Ilhan, about how Republicans don't care. But let's talk about your own voting record. You voted against tax relief for middle-class families. You voted against tougher penalties for violent criminals. You even voted against a bill that would protect small businesses from over-regulation. How does that help struggling Americans? Omar exhaled sharply. Because those bills were written by Republicans who had no intention of actually helping the people they claimed to represent. They were filled with loopholes, giveaways to corporations, and policies that would ultimately harm the very communities they pretended to care about. Leavitt tilted her head. So, let me get this straight. You didn't vote against them because they were bad for Americans. You voted against them because Republicans introduced them. Omar's lips pressed together. That's not what I said. Leavitt shrugged. Sounds like it to me. She turned to the cameras again, ensuring the moment would be captured for the millions watching at home. And yet, the very corporations you claim to fight against are among your biggest donors. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters exchanged glances. Omar's posture stiffened, but her expression remained firm. Every donation to my campaign is legal and publicly disclosed, she said, her voice sharp. Leavitt smirked. Publicly disclosed, sure, but ethically disclosed? She lifted another document. Because I have here a report showing that some of your largest donors have direct ties to lobbying groups that, let's just say, have a very interesting track record. Omar's expression flickered. Just for a second, it was barely perceptible, but Leavitt caught it, and she knew she had struck a nerve. This is a smear tactic, Omar said, shaking her head. It's what Republicans do when they have nothing real to offer the American people. Leavitt didn't let up. If it's a smear, then refute it right here, right now. Tell us, why are these groups pouring money into your campaign? A tense silence followed. Omar hesitated, and the cameras caught it. The seconds stretched unbearably long. Every reporter was watching, waiting. Finally, Omar exhaled sharply. This is a joke, she muttered. Leavitt smiled. You're free to leave, Ilhan, but walking away won't change the facts. Omar clenched her fists. I'm not going anywhere. Leavitt gestured toward the reporters. Then let's continue, because I'm just getting started. Omar inhaled deeply, regaining her composure, determined not to let Leavitt dictate the conversation. You want to talk about crime? She said, her voice firm but controlled. Let's talk about crime. Let's talk about how Republican lawmakers love to weaponize fear, using rising crime rates as a way to push policies that do nothing to address the root causes. Poverty, lack of education, systemic inequality. You throw out statistics, but you ignore the reasons behind them. She turned toward the reporters, as if making her case directly to them. We need real solutions. Community programs, investments in underserved neighborhoods, real criminal justice reform, not just more aggressive policing. Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a sharp breath, shaking her head slightly as if she had been expecting this exact response. Ah, the usual talking points, she said, her voice dripping with controlled amusement. It's always the system's fault, isn't it? It's always about how criminals are just misunderstood, how we need to throw more taxpayer money into programs that do nothing to actually protect innocent people. You say Republicans use crime as a political weapon? Ilhan, crime is a weapon, and it's being used against the American people every single day because of failed policies like yours. Omar narrowed her eyes. And what exactly do you propose, Karoline? More mass incarceration? More police brutality? Because we've seen where that leads. Leavitt leaned forward slightly, her tone razor sharp. I propose that we enforce the law. I propose that we stop treating violent criminals like victims and innocent families like an afterthought. I propose that we stop prioritizing political correctness over public safety. He lifted a page from her folder, reading off statistics. In the past 2 years alone, crime rates in Democrat-run cities have skyrocketed. Homicides up by double digits, carjackings through the roof, small businesses being looted while police are told to stand down. And what do? You defend policies that make it harder for police to do their jobs. Omar scoffed, shaking her head. That's an oversimplification, and you know it. Crime is complex. You can't just throw around numbers without context. Yes, crime has risen in some places, but do you know what else has risen? Economic struggles, inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic hit working-class families the hardest, and when people are struggling, crime... Leavitt cut in, her voice unwavering. There it is. More excuses, more blame shifting. Let me ask you something, Ilhan. Was the pandemic also responsible for violent criminals being released early from prison because of weak sentencing policies? Was the pandemic responsible for prosecutors refusing to press charges against looters and rioters because it didn't fit their narrative? Was the pandemic responsible for the fact that you and your party pushed to defund the police while crime spiraled out of control? The tension in the room thickened. Omar's lips pressed into a tight line. Nobody defunded the police, she said sharply. That's another Republican lie. Leavitt arched an eyebrow. Really, because I have here a statement, your own words in fact, where you openly supported relocating police budgets to social programs. And we all know what that really means. She flipped the page, reading aloud. We must divest from over-policing and reinvest in community solutions. That was you, wasn't it, Ilhan? Omar's jaw tightened. Yes, because investing in communities is how we prevent crime in the first place. Leavitt nodded slowly, feigning thoughtfulness. Right. And how's that working out? She gestured toward the reporters. Anyone here think crime is getting better? Silence. Even those usually sympathetic to Omar seemed hesitant to defend her now. Omar leaned forward, clearly irritated. So what's your solution, Karoline? More police, more surveillance, locking up more black and brown Americans? Leavitt's expression didn't change. My solution is simple. Stop protecting criminals more than law-abiding citizens. Stop making excuses. Stop pretending that progressive policies haven't made cities more dangerous. And most importantly, she tapped her folder, start taking responsibility for the consequences of your own actions. Omar shook her head, her patience wearing thin. And I suppose you think Republican policies are the answer? Leavitt smirked. I think policies that actually punish criminals instead of excusing them are a good start. The room was silent, the weight of the argument hanging between them. The battle lines had been drawn, and everyone watching could see who was winning. Omar exhaled sharply, shaking her head, but before she could speak, Leavitt had already flipped to another page in her folder. Let's move on, she said, her tone crisp and confident. Because while we're talking about accountability, there's something else that the American people deserve to know. Let's talk about your campaign donors. The moment those words left her lips, a visible shift occurred in the room. Reporters leaned in, cameras adjusted their focus, and even Omar, who had been trying to maintain her composure, stiffened slightly. Leavitt noticed. She had struck a nerve. Omar crossed her arms, her expression neutral, but her fingers lightly tapping against her elbow. Go ahead, Karoline, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Let's hear whatever conspiracy theory you're pushing next. Leavitt smirked, unfazed by the deflection. Oh, it's not a conspiracy, Ilhan. It's your own campaign finance records. She lifted a document, holding it up for the cameras. I have here a report showing that some of your largest donors have direct ties to foreign-link lobbying groups. You claim to stand for the American people, but it turns out a lot of your money isn't coming from everyday Americans. It's coming from organizations that have a very interesting track record when it comes to policy influence. The room tensed. Some reporters exchanged glances while others scribbled notes. Omar's jaw clenched slightly, but she didn't look away. Every donation to my campaign is legal and publicly disclosed, she said, her voice even. Leavitt nodded. Publicly disclosed, sure, but ethically disclosed? She let the words hang, then continued. Because what's interesting is that while you constantly attack corporations and special interests, you've been taking money from the same kinds of groups you claim to fight against. She flipped to another document. For example, let's look at these donors. Some of them have direct ties to lobbying efforts that push for policies you claim to oppose. How do you explain that, Ilhan? Omar exhaled, her fingers tightening against the table. This is nothing but a smear tactic. Republicans do this all the time when they have nothing real to offer the American people. They focus on distractions instead of solutions. Leavitt's smirk didn't waver. If it's a smear, then refute it, right here, right now. Tell us, why are these groups pouring money into your campaign? Omar hesitated for just a second, but the cameras caught it, the reporters caught it, and most importantly, the American people watching at home caught it. That single beat of silence was more powerful than any of Leavitt's words. This is absurd, Omar finally said, shaking her head. I don't answer to bad faith actors pushing right-wing propaganda. Leavitt chuckled, tilting her head. That's what politicians say when they don't have a real answer. She placed the documents back down on the podium. But don't worry, Ilhan. If you won't explain it, I'm sure the American people will figure it out for themselves. Leavitt barely paused before flipping to another page in her folder, her voice unwavering. Now, let's discuss something that millions of Americans still remember. Something you said that exposed exactly where your priorities lie. Ilhan, do you still stand by your infamous statement where you referred to 9/11 as, and I quote, some people did something? The room fell silent. The weight of the question settled over the reporters, the camera operators, and even the staffers at the back of the room. Omar's fingers tightened against the table, her expression unchanged, but the subtle tension in her posture spoke volumes. She had been waiting for this moment, yet it was clear she wasn't fully prepared for how it would be framed. A few journalists glanced at each other, sensing that this was about to become the defining moment of the press conference. Omar let out a slow breath before responding. "That comment has been deliberately misrepresented by bad faith actors like yourself, Karoline," she said, her tone measured but clipped. "Anyone who actually watched the speech in context knows I was talking about the discrimination Muslim Americans faced after 9/11, not downplaying the attack itself." Leavitt didn't blink. She let the words settle before shaking her head slightly. "Right. So let's clarify then. What exactly did you mean? Because to the thousands of Americans who lost loved ones that day, it sounded an awful lot like you were dismissing the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil as just something." Omar narrowed her eyes. "I don't need to explain myself to someone twisting my words to fit a partisan agenda." Leavitt raised an eyebrow, her smirk returning. "You mean holding public officials accountable for their own statements? Because that's exactly what I'm doing." She tapped the folder. "You say it was taken out of context, but here's the problem. When given the opportunity, you never clarified. You never came out and said, unequivocally, that 9/11 was an attack on American soil that killed nearly 3,000 innocent people. And now, when asked directly, you're still refusing to do so." Omar's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. Leavitt let the silence stretch, allowing the moment to play out on live television. She then leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but piercing. "I'll ask again, was 9/11 just something? Or was it an attack on this country by people who hated everything we stand for?" Omar crossed her arms, her voice colder now. "I refuse to play into your dishonest narrative." Leavitt's smirk widened. "You refuse to answer because you know the moment you do, you either have to admit you were wrong or double down on something indefensible." The tension in the room was suffocating. Even the reporters, some of whom had been sympathetic to Omar, now seemed to sense that she had just walked into a trap. Leavitt, seeing the flicker of discomfort on Omar's face, knew she had won this round. "You can deflect all you want," she said, standing straighter, "but the people watching at home see exactly what's happening here." Omar's silence spoke louder than any response she could have given. Leavitt flipped to another page in her folder, her expression unwavering as she prepared to deliver the final blow. "Now that we've addressed your troubling statements, let's talk about something even more important. Your voting record," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. Omar's posture stiffened, but she said nothing. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every moment, every flicker of emotion on her face. Leavitt continued, holding up yet another document. "You claim to fight for the working class, for everyday Americans, yet your voting history tells a very different story. You voted against tax relief for middle-class families. You voted against tougher penalties for violent criminals. You even voted against a bill that would protect small businesses from overregulation. Why?" Omar scoffed, shaking her head. "Because those bills were nothing more than Republican stunts, designed to help corporations and the wealthy while leaving working-class families with nothing." Leavitt arched an eyebrow. "Really? Because last I checked, middle-class tax cuts don't just benefit corporations, they benefit hard-working Americans. So tell me, Ilhan, why would you vote against helping the very people you claim to represent?" Mara exhaled sharply, her frustration evident. "Because those bills were filled with loopholes that benefited the rich while pretending to help the middle class. I stand by my votes." Leavitt smirked. "Of course you do. And yet the very corporations you rail against are some of your biggest donors." She held up another paper. "Let's talk about that, shall we? While you publicly criticize corporate influence, your campaign is being funded by some of the very same special interests you claim to oppose. How do you explain that?" Omar's jaw tightened. "I don't take money that influences my policies. My record speaks for itself." Leavitt nodded. "Exactly. And your record shows that you vote against the very people you claim to fight for. So, Ilhan, which is it? Are you really standing up for everyday Americans, or are you just another politician saying one thing while doing another? The silence that followed was deafening. The room was still, reporters glancing between the two women, sensing that Omar had no real answer. Omar let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the table, but before she could speak, Leavitt stepped back from the podium. "You can twist things however you want," she said, her voice steady, "but the truth is already out there, and the American people are watching." Omar opened her mouth, as if to respond, but nothing came out. The damage had already been done. Leavitt had controlled the conversation from start to finish, and Omar's silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. The cameras captured it all: her hesitation, her frustration, and most importantly, her defeat. Omar inhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table as if steadying herself. She had faced tough debates before, but this one was different. This time, the pressure wasn't just from a hostile opponent. It was from the silence that filled the room, the weight of unanswered questions hanging in the air. Reporters, who had once nodded along to her rhetoric, now sat in rigid anticipation, their pens hovering over notepads, their eyes flicking between her and Karoline Leavitt. The cameras remained locked on her, recording every second of hesitation, every flicker of discomfort. She knew she had to say something, anything, to regain control of the narrative, but before she could find the right words, Leavitt spoke again. "You see, Ilhan," Leavitt said, her voice steady and sharp, "it's not just about what you say. It's about what you refuse to say. The American people aren't stupid. They see the hesitation, the deflections, the refusal to take responsibility. And they're tired of it." She took a step back from the podium, tapping her folder against the surface, as if signaling that her case had been made. "This isn't about political theater. It's about accountability. It's about making sure the people in power answer for their decisions. And right now, all they're seeing is someone who refuses to answer simple questions." Omar's lips pressed together. She had two choices: fight back or walk away. The problem was, she could already feel the battle slipping through her fingers. Every move she made now would be scrutinized, dissected, turned into viral clips and headlines. If she lashed out, it would only reinforce the perception that she was crumbling under pressure. If she stayed silent, it would confirm what many were already thinking, that Karoline Leavitt had just publicly dismantled her credibility. A reporter from the back broke the silence. "Congresswoman Omar, do you have any direct response to the accusations presented today?" Omar's jaw clenched, but she forced a tight smile. "This entire conversation has been nothing but bad faith attacks," she said, her voice clipped. "I refuse to participate in a political stunt that is designed to distract from the real issues facing Americans." Leavitt chuckled. "Ah, there it is again. More deflection, more excuses." She shook her head slightly. "You can call it a stunt all you want, but the people watching at home saw what just happened here. They saw who had the answers and who didn't." Omar glanced briefly at her staffers, who were standing near the back of the room, their faces tense. She could feel them silently urging her to cut her losses. Finally, she took a breath, squared her shoulders, and turned away from the podium. Without another word, she walked off, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as reporters shouted follow-up questions behind her. Leavitt stood still for a moment, watching her go. Then she turned back to the podium, placed her hands on it, and looked directly into the cameras. "Well," she said, smirking, "I think that says everything." The room erupted in whispers as journalists scribbled furiously, realizing they had just witnessed something rare: a political figure retreating under pressure, unable to withstand the weight of their own contradiction. Omar had left the room, but her silence would follow her far beyond this press conference. Leavitt, meanwhile, had done exactly what she set out to do: not just win the debate, but win the perception of strength, clarity, and conviction. And in Washington, perception was everything. The moment Ilhan Omar walked off the stage, the media frenzy erupted. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, producers at major news networks rushed to edit the most damning clips, and within minutes the internet was flooded with reactions. Social media exploded as the footage of Omar's silence, hesitation, and eventual retreat spread like wildfire. Hashtags like "Leavitt destroys Omar" and "Omar exposed" shot to the top of trending lists. Conservative commentators seized the moment, labeling it a career-ending debacle, while left-leaning outlets scrambled to reframe the narrative, calling it a Republican smear campaign. But no matter how the spin was attempted, the undeniable fact remained. Omar had failed to answer the tough questions, and millions had watched it happen live. Cable news networks quickly cut into their programming to analyze the confrontation. On conservative platforms, Leavitt was hailed as a rising star, a fearless warrior who had done what few could: stand toe-to-toe with a progressive heavyweight and leave her speechless. The clips of her calmly pressing Omar on crime, campaign donors, and the infamous 9/11 comment were replayed repeatedly, reinforcing the image of a poised and prepared leader against a flustered and unprepared politician. Meanwhile, mainstream media figures attempted damage control, with some commentators arguing that Omar had simply refused to engage in Republican theatrics. Yet even among her usual allies, there was unease. One prominent journalist admitted on air, "It wasn't a good look. The lack of direct answers will hurt her." Back in Washington, Democratic strategists were already in crisis mode. Omar's team rushed to issue statements, framing the event as an ambush orchestrated by conservative operatives, but the damage was done. Headlines dominated the news cycle. Omar walks away as Leavitt holds her accountable. Karoline Leavitt's masterclass in political combat, and why won't Ilhan Omar answer the questions? Even those who supported Omar were forced to admit that the optics were disastrous. Meanwhile, Leavitt's camp celebrated. Her performance had cemented her as a political force, someone who could command a national audience and dictate the conversation. While Omar and her allies tried to shift attention elsewhere, Leavitt didn't need to say another word. The press had already made its verdict clear. This was her victory, and everyone knew it. As the media firestorm raged on, Karoline Leavitt remained exactly where she wanted to be, above it all, watching as the fallout from her confrontation with Ilhan Omar unfolded, just as she had anticipated. There was no need for frantic damage control, no rush to clarify or defend her position, because the narrative had already been written. Omar's silence, her hesitation, and ultimately her decision to retreat had become the defining images of the event, cementing Leavitt's victory in the minds of millions. Conservative media hailed her as a rising political powerhouse, someone who didn't just hold her ground, but commanded the conversation. Even some left-leaning analysts, though reluctant to say it outright, acknowledged that Omar's refusal to engage had cost her credibility. The damage was done, and no amount of posturing from Omar's team could undo what the cameras had already captured. Back in Washington, Omar's allies scrambled to reframe the disaster. Her team issued carefully crafted statements, calling the press conference a Republican smear attempt, a coordinated attack meant to distract from more pressing issues. Progressive commentators rushed to her defense, insisting that she had been wise to refuse to engage with bad faith accusations. But despite their efforts, the truth was clear. The American people had watched the exchange with their own eyes, and no amount of spin could erase what they had seen. Clips of the confrontation dominated social media, with hashtags like "Leavitt exposes Omar" and "Omar walks away" trending for days. Conservative pundits dissected every moment, praising Leavitt's composure, sharp responses, and refusal to let Omar off the hook. On major networks, political analysts debated what this moment meant for the future, with one respected journalist noting, "This wasn't just a debate. This was a shift in power, a moment that will follow Omar for years to come." Meanwhile, Leavitt's team celebrated behind closed doors, recognizing the significance of what had just happened. It wasn't just about this one event. It was about momentum. Leavitt had proven she could go toe-to-toe with a seasoned politician, unshaken, confident, and prepared. The performance had solidified her status as a rising force in conservative politics, someone who could handle pressure, control the conversation, and turn the tables on an opponent with ease. Calls poured in from media outlets eager to feature her in follow-up interviews, while Republican strategists took note of the commanding presence she displayed under fire. But Leavitt wasn't in a hurry to flood the airwaves with victory laps. Instead, she chose to let the moment speak for itself, knowing that the more her opponents flailed to spin the story, the worse it looked for them. When she finally engaged, it was with the kind of calculated restraint that only reinforced her confidence. With a smirk, she logged into Twitter and posted a single retweet. A video clip of Omar's silence, followed by 3 simple words. The people saw. It was all she needed to say. In a world where media narratives shift rapidly and public figures are scrutinized under an unrelenting spotlight, the story of Karoline Leavitt and Ilhan Omar's confrontation offers valuable lessons that extend beyond politics. One of the most important takeaways is the power of preparation and composure in the face of adversity. Leavitt didn't just win the debate because she had strong arguments. She won because she was calm, confident, and prepared. This is a lesson that applies to everyday life, especially for those who have spent decades navigating challenges, whether in their careers, personal relationships, or community leadership. The ability to stand firm in one's beliefs while maintaining grace under pressure is a skill that can make all the difference when faced with difficult conversations or moments of confrontation. Another critical message is the importance of truth and accountability. In today's fast-paced digital world, information can be twisted, taken out of context, and manipulated to serve different agendas. However, facts still matter, and those who present them clearly, without evasion, tend to gain credibility over time. For older generations who have witnessed the evolution of media from newspapers to television to the internet, this serves as a reminder that integrity and honesty still hold value, even in an era dominated by political spin. Being informed and questioning narratives instead of accepting them at face value is an essential habit, one that becomes even more important as misinformation spreads rapidly. The confrontation also highlights the power of perception and how silence can be louder than words. Omar's failure to provide clear answers became a defining moment, reinforcing the idea that avoiding tough questions can be more damaging than addressing them head-on. In daily life, this applies to situations where people may be hesitant to take responsibility or clarify their stance on an issue. Whether in family discussions, business decisions, or civic engagement, evasion often leads to loss of trust. Standing by one's words, owning mistakes, and addressing concerns directly earns far more respect than avoidance or defensiveness. Finally, this event underscores the importance of lifelong learning and adaptability. Leavitt demonstrated a mastery of her arguments because she had done her homework. For seniors who have spent a lifetime acquiring wisdom and experience, this serves as encouragement that learning never stops. The world is changing, politically, technologically, and socially, but staying informed, engaged, and willing to adapt ensures that one's voice remains relevant and influential. Whether it's understanding new political landscapes, embracing technology, or guiding younger generations with wisdom, the ability to continue growing and evolving is a testament to true leadership. Ultimately, this story is not just about politics. It's about character, resilience, and the power of truth. It's a reminder that how we respond to challenges defines us, and that those who stand firm, speak clearly, and uphold their values will always be remembered, not just for what they said, but for the strength and conviction behind their words.